There are two types of people in this world. Complete morons who don't know anything and shouldn't be allowed to make their own decisions, and us Dark Souls 2 fans. A group of intellectuals who can discern right from wrong and have come to realize that Dark Souls 2 is the crowning achievement of humanity. Everything I just said can probably be found on some Reddit post or message board somewhere, and you'll find even more people arguing the opposite, that Dark Souls 2 is somehow a terrible game that nobody should play for their own spiritual safety. But I think the majority of us can agree that both of these extremes are completely ridiculous. Dark Souls 2 is my favorite Dark Souls, but I don't really want to go to war over it. Today, I'd just like to explain why I personally enjoy the experience of Dark Souls 2, starting with its sense of adventure and exploration, the feeling you get when you discover Haid Tower of Flame, or find a hidden pathway in the Forest of Fallen Giants. This sense of adventure is present in every FromSoft game I've played, but there's something really enchanting about the way Dark Souls 2 does it. Some unassuming pathway that might lead you on for several hours of gameplay. It doesn't even connect to the main path, and you may not reach the end of it. But it's something to explore, something to gain from. It's another corner of this game's ancient, ruinous world. Now, these are all things you could say about Dark Souls 1, which has a similarly great sense of adventure. But for me, there are several facets of Dark Souls 2's gameplay that lend itself to this forward-moving, adventurous feeling. In Dark Souls 2, there's something called Life Gems. Life Gems are a consumable that slowly restores health, and can be used to spare an Estus flask for a less urgent heal. This is a big deal on its own, but mostly it's a side effect of a broader change. Dark Souls 2, specifically Scholar of the First Sin, has a lot of enemies between bonfires. Just your flasks might not be enough to get you to a checkpoint, especially when so many of this game's bonfires are hidden away. Going through a Dark Souls 2 area has a thicker, heavier feel to it than the other games because of this. Reaching the next bonfire almost never feels like it's just a bonfire run. You really have to fight off incoming threats, or they will overwhelm you. But there is a way to make an area easier, because in Dark Souls 2, you can completely get rid of an enemy if you kill them enough, meaning that you're rewarded for not just running past everything. If you're stuck on an area, you can keep trying to kill everything, and eventually, certain enemies will stop respawning. This slower, heavier progression is one of my favorite things about Dark Souls 2. It feels like the difficulty of an area is largely due to the size of it, the sprawling pathways, and the quantity of enemies, whereas sometimes in Dark Souls 3 or even Elden Ring, it can feel like all the difficulty is saved for the boss fight, since most of the area can just be skipped. But the downside is that Dark Souls 2 has mostly underwhelming boss fights that are almost always too easy, and I think this is a big cause for the rift in Souls fans. Generally speaking, people who appreciate an area, its enemies, and its secrets will like Dark Souls 2. Whereas somebody who values individual encounters like good boss fights and single difficult enemies will probably dislike Dark Souls 2. But if you're like me, the boss fights are complementary to a level's environment, design, gear, and enemies. And let me just say, Dark Souls 2 has no shortage of content. Not only does it have a sizable base game with plenty of side areas, but there are also 3 expansions, which feel like they cumulatively double this game's content. Then after you've beaten the game, you can enter New Game Plus and replay it with all kinds of added enemies and items. Even on your 3rd run through in New Game Plus Plus, you'll still be running into new enemy placements and boss drops, which is another theme of this game that I think really builds into that grand, adventurous sense. The freedom and limitlessness. In Dark Souls 2, you can farm enemies for practically any material. You can unlimitedly farm Titanite slabs, human effigies, and even bonfire ascetics, which can be used to bring a single area into the next New Game Plus. Or if you want to farm an enemy without it disappearing or having to use a bonfire ascetic, you can join the Champions Covenant to make the enemies permanent. And with an endgame soul farm like the Giant Lord farm, you can level up as high as you really want without the farm losing its potency. All of this culminates into a sense of freedom with your character. 100 hours later, and I'm still getting levels, I'm still upgrading my gear, I never hit some kind of a soft cap where I can't realistically progress my character anymore. Dark Souls 2 is the only Dark Souls game that turns New Game Plus into more than just another playthrough. For example, I'm trying to get all my pyromancies for an achievement, but there's one that I'm still going for that's sold by an NPC in New Game Plus Plus. Now, I fully understand that this sounds like a nightmare for somebody who doesn't really like this game, but as somebody who looks forward to my next jaunt through No Man's Wharf, my next messing up the Lucatiel questline, for me, the fact that I still have things to do 2 playthroughs and 100 hours later is awesome. Hey, maybe by New Game Plus 7 I'll have figured out the storyline, which is just as cryptic as any other Souls game, but notably more melancholy. In the other two games, you start with a cutscene hyping up the primary bosses, while making sure you know that you don't stand a chance against them. But Dark Souls 2 doesn't even give you the time of day. It just throws you into the world and lets you figure it out if you want to. Dark Souls 2's story doesn't care about you. It doesn't care if you know what's happening, it doesn't care to fill you in. It doesn't care if you care. And so, while it may not have quite the impact or be as memorable as the other Dark Souls storylines, that sort of makes it the most Dark Souls in a way. So, in conclusion, while Dark Souls 1 tries to create a cryptic storyline while avoiding a confusing storyline, Dark Souls 2 power stances both. And where Dark Souls 1 and 3 let you play through again, Dark Souls 2 incentivizes it. When the other Souls games say, be careful with those materials, you won't get many more this playthrough, Dark Souls 2 says, be careful with those materials, unless you're cool killing more of those weird dinosaur things, then go ahead and plus 10 it. And when Benhart of Jugo says, here, take this fake Moonlight Greatsword, Lucatiel says, yeah, but did you summon me for the rotten? Dark Souls 2 is my favorite Dark Souls game, and that's why. Not the missing Lucatiel thing, that sucks, I'm talking about everything else. Let me know what you like or dislike about Dark Souls 2. At the end of the day, it's a solid game that you probably either love or hate. Anyways, I appreciate you watching. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.